A recent study has found that by the year 2030, nearly half of all women will be single and childless. As the birth rate continues to drop, it is the Christian's job to remind the world of the blessing that is marriage and children. The church should also examine whether or not we've contributed to this culture of death. On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I will be joined by Pastor Jeff Wright to explore these topics. All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, doing my best to represent him well wherever I go. As I mentioned in the opening, I am joined by Jeff Wright. So, Jeff, go ahead and introduce yourself to those who are not yet familiar.
Connor, thanks for having me on, man. It's always an honor to be asked. I'm a husband, father, pastor, do a little farming, teach at a private Christian school. Nothing too dramatic, but it sure suits me.
Awesome. Well, glad to have you back as always, Jeff. It's always fun to have you on. Before we get started, for you listeners, feel free to go to my Substack. That is forgeandanvil.substack.com. You can put in your email there. It's completely free, and I just send you all these episodes when they drop in podcast format. And there is a paid option there if you want to leave a little tip. I'd appreciate that, but no pressure on that front. Like and share this video. That is also free. It boosts us in the algorithms, and it really does help out the show. And you can follow me on Twitter or X, whatever you prefer to call it, at Forge and A for additional content and updates on the show. All right. Well, that being said, let's go ahead and dive straight in here, Jeff. So, I ran into this article. I had sent it to you in preparation for tonight by EV Magazine. I believe they're kind of a conservative women's magazine that is a fairly new launch. I have not really spent much time looking into their background, but I found this article really interesting, and it's titled 45% of women are expected to be single and childless by 2030 per recent projection. So what I'll go ahead and do here is I'll just read this article, and you and I can kind of start picking it apart and responding to it. We're told by our culture that a woman who is unmarried and has no children is empowered and in charge of her own life. She has escaped the unnecessary burden of raising a family and being a slave to her husband. At least that's what our society has convinced us. Sadly, many women have adopted the modern feminist lifestyle and have chosen to sleep around, abort their baby if they unexpectedly get pregnant, and swear off marriage. But these cultural trends are going to have a tremendous impact on the future of American society. Morgan Stanley estimates that 45% of women in their prime working years, ages 25 to 44, will be single and childless by the time 2030 arrives. In 2019, Morgan Stanley published an article outlining women's impact on the American economy. The number of prime working age women in the U.S. has been increasing steadily, and most of them are single and completely focused on their career. These women will continue to have a greater representation in the workforce, helping to boost wages. Economist Ellen Zettner explained, in the past, education or lower paying occupational choices largely drove the pay gap. Today, motherhood is by far the largest contributor to the wage pay gap, which since women who become mothers often choose to stop working or work fewer hours. But it looks like there will be fewer and fewer mothers over the next couple of decades as women choose to commit themselves to work rather than start a family. The number of single women in the U.S. is expected to increase 1.2% every year from 2018 to 2030, compared to a 0.8% increase for the overall population. This is likely going to result in 45% of women between ages 25 and 44 who will be single and childless by 2030. That is an increase from 41% of women in that age group being single and childless in 2018. These shifting lifestyle norms are enabling more women with or without children to work full-time, which should continue to raise the labor force participation rate among single females, Zentner says. Single women spend more than the average family household, especially when it comes to travel, nightlife, eating out, skincare, and beauty, retail shopping, etc. So, of course, economists will attempt to frame it in a positive light that nearly half of women are single and childless. It can only be good for the economy. However, few are considering the negative impact this will have on a greater society. The birth replacement rate is already trending low, below replacement, and surveys show that women who are unmarried and childless tend to struggle more with mental illness and feelings of self confidence. Single, childless women may be buying more things at the mall and traveling to various American cities, but at what cost in the long run? The bedrock of a healthy society is the nuclear family, and it's sad to think that we will see fewer and fewer families in the future, which of course means fewer children and happily married couples. Meanwhile, young women in their prime working years devote themselves to a career and a boss who doesn't truly care about them, have promiscuous sex that has negative impact on their mental health, and miss out on the true lifelong fulfillment that comes with being a wife and a mother. So again, that article was from Evie Magazine. So be sure to check them out if you're interested in reading the whole thing for yourself. Obviously, it's not too long of an article, so I just figured it would be beneficial to kind of frame the entire conversation by reading that whole thing out there. But yeah, I mean, I've obviously got a lot of thoughts, and we'll unpack them all throughout the night, Jeff. But I'll turn it over to you to give your kind of initial reaction to the article as a whole.
It seems like the idea of the liberated, life of child-free care is maybe the quintessential example of our cultural lie that freedom from obligation is actual freedom rather than dissolution and a path to misery. You just start with that paragraph. Oh, they're free from the burdens and like slave language of families and whatnot. I'm like, well, so they're a slave to their boss. They're a slave to the shifting winds of Instagram. What a great win for women. But that's the payoff of these cultural lies. You call it a culture of death. It's not. We haven't got to the place of like a culture of death. This is a culture of barrenness, and it's this lie that somehow the blessed life is supposed to be found in complete autonomy. And basically every generation around the globe up until ours, since maybe the 60s, has known what a foolish proposition that is. But we have tremendous resources at the government, educational and advertising level, entertainment as well, trying to sell this lie. And based on those rising statistics, they're doing a good job. But what it's going to terminate in is basically ladies living most of their life in misery if they have a natural lifespan. It's awful. It's awful to watch it play out and to hear the lie, know where it's going, and feel so disenfranchised to do anything about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of things that I think are contributing to this rising trend. Obviously, we see the food that we eat is affecting fertility. We see so much feminist propaganda out there trying to encourage women to be boss babes. But I think it's very multifaceted. But what would you say, just from 10,000 foot view, is maybe where we started to go off the rail with these sort of things? You mentioned the 60s. So what's your take on that, Jeff?
Yeah, well, so I'm going to go somewhere that maybe if anybody knows me wouldn't expect, but Pope Benedict, before he was the Pope, was Cardinal Ratzinger, and he was a theologian. And it was nice when the Pope was Catholic, and so at some point, reading on theology of reproductive technology, I came across his writings when I think he was with the Inquisition. And the Catholic opposition to birth control had always, up until the point I read the article, had always kind of mystified me. Why were they so staunchly against this technology? And what Ratzinger did in that piece was really show how untethering sex from the telos that it is designed to pursue starts unraveling the fabric of human existence. And he's writing this in the 60s as the sexual revolution is kicking off. And so I want to give more credibility to people who called their shot, who saw where we're at now coming, and who diagnosed it at ground zero as we're living in the blast radius of it. And so he doesn't have these categories or these terms, but when he starts talking about disconnecting reproduction from the fabric of human existence, he really gets close to predicting the rise of transgenderism. And he sees how this is going to start unpeeling and separating domestic life, women from their own bodies, women from their creational design. And it's just kind of staggering to read him on that back in the 60s. And so that, it was a Catholic guy who showed me these things first. And I was probably reading that 2010, 2012, something like that. We're so much further down the road now, but he really saw a lot of this coming.
Yeah. And what I think is interesting is, there's a lot of different people that have kind of gone back and tried to sort of catalog what exactly went wrong. And so to your point, it's interesting to be able to give credit to these individuals who actually called it. Like The Age of Entitlement is a great book that really recaps a lot of what went wrong in America starting in the 60s. And of course, they talk about the sexual revolution, but it's just so much crazier to think about actually being in it and having the wherewithal to actually recognize it as it was in its infancy. I think what's interesting currently is now we are noticing that there is such a hostility towards individuals that point this fact out, that single women is becoming a rising a trend that we're unfortunately going to continue to see rise throughout the next several years as we continue on in culture, assuming that we continue on down this path. We see individuals like JD Vance made some flippant comment years back about childless cat ladies, and then it's become the whole mantra of the left this entire election cycle, trying to say that JD Vance is a terrible person for putting down these single women. But you and I know that as husbands and fathers, that really JD Vance is not putting down these women for no reason. It's not normative to have a large population of grown women who are single. And that's what I really wanted to explore with you tonight, is talking a lot about the church's role in this, because I really think there's a lot of things, of course, that have contributed within the church to single women being a rising trend. But one of the things that I think I noticed a lot when I was going to a Christian university is the fact that so many of these individuals are going to school and they think of themselves as the Apostle Paul, pursuing singleness because singleness is this righteous thing. And I would make the argument that singleness is absolutely a righteous thing if you are specifically pursuing singleness so that you can pursue a life of missional work. I think that the single man especially has the ability to do things like go off into remote places and contact these tribes that don't even speak English, so that he can translate the Bible word by word, for this tribe to, and risking life and limb. We hear these stories of these missionaries quite literally being skewered alive by these tribes. And to me, that is the type of missional mindset that Paul is describing when he talks about how, these individuals should seek to be like him in his singleness. But I think the issue is that it seems like the Church of America has taken that little bit of advice that Paul's given and ignores his other advice, where he encourages individuals, in other letters to the church, to seek marriage. We've just taken that one bit of Paul's advice and blown it up and act like it's very normal to pick one of two paths, either marriage or singleness, as if they are equal. And as if they are equally normal for, individuals. Like half the population is going to say single, half the population is going to get married. And that's okay, because that's, the Apostle Paul says it's okay. And I think that that's taking something that should be an outlier and trying to pretend that it is broadly applicable to all of culture.
Yeah, I mean, that's another one of those prolonged and profound propaganda pushes that we've experienced. Matthew Lee Anderson is a name that comes to my mind pretty quickly. He is kind of a pretty young thing of the Young Restless and Reform movement, who has really pushed this idea that singleness is some kind of special status to aspire to. You can find him on Mere Orthodoxy or Davenant Gospel Coalition, some, I'm guessing. You should not find him there. He's awful. He's not someone to pay attention to. He tries to hide behind his opposition to in vitro fertilization, but really he wants to create a world where in vitro fertilization is non-existent because no one is interested in having children. And so you've got these regime theologians, zeitgeist theologians who want to do the exact same thing. They want to create a barren culture, and they come up with theological rhetoric that's kind of wrapped in superficial Christianese to tell people like this is really the better life. And you know, you can go broader than that. You read David Platt's Radical and some of those books that came out in the early 2000s. You know, if your life is not singularly dedicated to some sort of extreme context mission, well, you must be compromised and you must be a shallow Christian and whatnot. And it's pretty easy to connect those dots. And what they're really doing, you know, I hope those men are Christians. You know, I can't speak to that. I hope they're Christians, but their teaching is really the teaching of the serpent. You can hear a hiss when they say it, because what they're doing is despising the chief indication that Scripture repeatedly returns to of God's blessing on an individual. You know, I've been in Genesis for some time now with my church, and it's startling to me how clear Genesis is that when the text says God blessed something, what it means is he made it able to reproduce. And so you have these regime theologians, you have the regime itself, you have the spirit of the age, self-consciously calling evil good and good evil and saying that blessing that God gives, you're going to opt out of and cope and tell yourself that you've somehow found this more glorious or this more holy lifestyle. You know, the David Platt model is just Instagram and dope passport stamps for Christians. And it's all a lie. It's all a lie, and it comes from hell.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think the issue, this is something that I've been just noticing so much lately, both in personal conversations and you know, macro trends, that within the church, we tend to focus on the exception and not the rule when it comes to these criticisms. So, for example, you just painted with a broad brush to describe, you know, the kind of the state of our culture and the state of American evangelicalism. And immediately my mind went to where people in the comments may be currently typing right now. You know, what about that godly couple that is struggling to have children? You know, they're following God righteously, but they're struggling with infertility. And immediately, you know, I would say that is the exception, not the rule. And to fixate on that as if they can now throw away everything that you just laid out, Jeff, I think is a mistake. But just to give a little bit of a steel man to that argument for a moment, what would you say to the couple that is struggling? You know, that's a righteous, godly couple, but they find themselves in the midst of infertility.
Well, there's quite a few angles on that, but just to I kind of smirked when you were laying out this instinct you feel to kind of honor that. You know, my habit, my pattern is to preach verse by verse the books of the Bible. And so, like I said, I've been in Genesis, and Genesis is so consistent about God's blessing on fertility that I have often been writing my sermon feeling this kind of internal burden to say, what are the single people? What are the childless people going to think about this? Because you just keep having to come back to it over and over. It's one of those times to be thankful for expository preaching, because you just have to say, you know what? I've still got to say what the text says, even if it runs up against really important issues and deep emotional anxieties that people have. So to the couple, there's a couple different things. One version of that is simply a difficult providence, and it's the kind of thing to mourn over. It's the kind of thing to wish otherwise. But if that's the Lord's providence for you, it doesn't mean that you don't have a hand in serving future generations and encouraging fertility. You can be a support to families in your congregation, not just young families. Adoption is readily at hand. I would encourage you not to pursue most of the reproductive technologies that are out there. I think there's some. If you have a wise elder, he can or a set of elders that can navigate you through the ones that are appropriate for Christians. But there's a host of ways either to pursue reproduction, if that's medically available through reparative medicine, or adoption, or simply being a blessing to the families around you and letting the Lord use the church to feel some of the relational sadness that you feel from your inability to reproduce. Not everything God calls into someone's life is the sort of thing we would ask for, but we know that He does all things well. He does everything for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. And so whatever, if that's a difficult providence you have, you're still able to live in the Lord's will. You don't have to treat it like it's not a sad thing, but it also doesn't have to define you, and it doesn't prevent you from contributing to a culture of fertility. Now, there's another version of that I think really goes unaddressed because we don't like to talk about consequences. And so there's a host of people in those circumstances who, because they were told, well, you need to get your degree done. Well, you probably ought to get your master's done. Well, you probably ought to start on your career and get your CV, get a few items on your CV in case you return to the workforce. And so by the time they're past their most fertile reproductive years, because they've been pursuing what the Bible would call foolishness in forestalling reproduction, they're now dealing with the consequences of that choice. And that's kind of a different thing. That's not a difficult providence. You're now reaping what you've sown. And the right thing to do there is to repent appropriately. Again, I started seeing this early in my ministry, even before I was a pastor, and I was serving in supplementary staff. These people in their 40s, mid 40s and on, who had pretty wonderful careers at that point and big houses and a lot of the perks that come with career lifestyle, they couldn't get out of the natural law. And so, we have phrases for that, right? Like the biological clock is ticking. And so they would go in and try to start having children. Their bodies were not in prime position to do that. And I can remember being in prayer meetings where, these men and women would just be weeping in despair because the fertility treatment didn't work this month. And she had to go back for this humiliating, invasive procedure to try again. And all of it was a consequence of believing these careerist lies. And that's there's a different response to that. You're reaping foolishness, and repentance is going to look kind of different. It's going to look like not torturing your body. It might look like something like a snowflake adoption. Go find a child who's been kept on deep storage and see if you can gestate that child. And that can be the way you adopt it, particularly if you want the experience of pregnancy. There are some options available to you, but that's not so much a difficult providence as it is to be brought before the Lord as reaping what you've sown and asking Him to guide you out of it with appropriate steps now that you realize the mistakes you made in the past, which everyone has to do. Every Christian knows the experience of looking back on foolish choices in the past and saying, I can't go back and undo them. So what would the Lord have me to do now going forward? I mean, that's the category for the second.
Yeah. I tend to find no fault with those categories. I think the thing that I think about too is I think about the young woman who, maybe isn't too far gone as far as her body's ability to have children. But she's maybe still bought into the lie. I think first of all, I think the individuals who are pushing that lie, I think, are going to be held responsible in the next life. And to what degree, that's up to the only one who's equipped to judge, to ultimately determine what that looks like. But I really do think that our culture plays into it. And so I think for me, I just look at this trend of 45% of women are expected to be single and childless by 2030. And I immediately start to think, what can be done to fix that? Because obviously, Connor and Jeff Wright don't have the ability to single-handedly turn this ship around. But I do think that having these conversations, on these platforms is maybe one step in the right direction. So where do you think that we go from here, Jeff?
Well, we're probably, unless the Lord intervenes, we're probably going to have to live through a catastrophe. And demographically, there's no way out. You don't, just the dynamics you're talking about here is already telling us that there's a tidal wave of barrenness that's coming. And there's a host of societal problems with that. We're living in a time when they tell us that, we've got to have unchecked immigration because we don't have a workforce. Well, we don't have a workforce because we've been aborting them for decades. Right. And now we're voluntarily barren. There's just lifestyle consequences that are going to be tremendous for us. So I don't know that I have an easy route out of that. But I'll tell you what I think we can do. One, we can have kids. We can kind of push, our own selves to show that we really do love children by having a bunch of them. We can have open homes and hospitable homes so that, particularly as kind of the Titus 2 model, as younger people see older people model not just having children, but just rejoicing in the unique delight that children are. That's a really important apologetic on this topic. Mm-hmm. I talked to a Christian college group a few years ago. It was a campus ministry, and they were having a hard time. They were talking about hot button issues. So the students had submitted several different questions, and they'd had local pastors kind of pick the topics they wanted to talk about, but they couldn't find anyone to talk about homosexuality. And the guy reached out to me and said, "Jeff, look, nobody else has wanted to touch this. Would you do it?" And so I was glad to. And I went and talked to those students, and these were students who cared enough about their faith to be involved in campus ministries, right? And so what I did is kind of an overview of the biblical presentation of sexuality and its purpose from Ephesians, right? Like, this is how God builds into the fabric of human existence an understanding of how Christ loves the church, and the church loves Christ, and that love is fertile. It produces. But I told them I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that because this group of students knew the biblical data. They knew what the Bible taught. But what I told them is, you're never going to give this self to you until you internally see this as lovely. Until you have an aesthetic fascination and appreciation for this, you're not going to do it, because all the data in the world can't make you do the right thing. The closest you can get to that is training your affections to direct you towards what's good. And so I encourage them along these same lines. Find families in your church, spend time with them. Find people who delight in their children and spend time with them. See if it's really better, right? And I think that's kind of where the church can be the front line in turning this over. One of the things that I'm worried about is young men seem to be trending more right wing. Young women tend to be trending more left wing. It's going to exacerbate this problem. I would tell young men, you'd better account for this very seriously. God is sovereign. In his providence, he'll do what he wants, but you need to think about yourself in a commodities market. There's going to be a lot more men looking for women to start households with, and there are going to be women looking to do the same. And so you better present yourself as someone who has your stuff together, who's about something, who's got something that would make a young lady feel compelled that she could trust you to begin a family with, and the kind of person she could build a stable life with. And I would tell you, start young. When you're 18, 19, 20, 21, you better be on this road and hopefully several steps down it. And if you're not, you better get on it as soon as you can. I do think women will follow the men that they love. And so there's a way to recover women who are trending left wing. The natural law tends to do that. That's another reason I think that these statistics are so sideways. The devil knows that living as a human, namely having children, building a household, it tends to humanize us. And so by keeping us from those things through these societal forces, he can dehumanize us. If you're going to buck that trend as an individual, you better get started really quick. And, young ladies, there's sort of there's an advantage to that. You're a prized commodity. You don't have to settle. You don't have to. In the world that's coming, you can be very choosy about who God puts in front of you to begin a household with. And so enjoy being a rare commodity. You're going to be, and be wise and take full advantage of that. Make a man rise to pursue you and capture your affections.
Well said. Pistol Creek in the chat said, there are a lot of single people in our church. It's not that they are pursuing other things, but something in the culture is making it harder these days. Then Michaela said in the chat, I think there are not enough people guiding these couples through the process of owning these repercussions. There are more people trying to tell them it's okay. We can try to fix it.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true, Michaela. And usually it's like, hey, we can have a pill, or we can inject you with this. You were talking about how to kind of fix this. I think one of the ways that as an apologist you can help people see the insanity they live in is by pointing out the contradictions that they may have turned a blind eye to. So you think about the age we live in. You mentioned at the beginning that our food is pretty clearly being, if not poisoned, toxified, and there's something more than just making nutrition cheaply available to people, motivating food corporations and government policies. But I've never lived in a time where people were more serious about organics, non-GMOs, being careful about seed oils. They're very conscientious about what they put into their body. And, I have a wife. She has friends. I have a daughter who's getting old enough to start thinking about this stuff. This is a selling item for, cosmetics and the kinds of creams and sauces that women rub on their faces to make them glow or whatever they do. And they constantly advertise themselves as all natural, organic, whatever, right? The point being, there's no crazy chemicals that you're rubbing on your skin, right? Think about the kind of chemicals that a woman has to inject into her body every month to prevent herself from conceiving a child.
Right.
Think about how schizophrenic that is. We have to have organic tea leaves to exfoliate our pores. But we will, in the most intimate parts of our body, put synthetic hormone with documented ramifications in order to be able to have casual sex without creating a child. Your body thinks you're trying to make a baby when you have sex. It takes incredible technological resources to get in the way of that. And the same women who are buying, all organic exfoliants are just happily giving themselves to the kind of things that clearly not just disrupt the natural order, but bring things like uterine cancer and all kinds of other crazy consequences that you would never accept from your protein shake, right?
Right.
But you'll take it into your body every month.
Right. For sure. And there's a whole bunch of other side effects that, you haven't even mentioned. Like it's been proven that women on birth control are actually more attracted to feminine men. Just things like that where, I immediately think
Connor, if I can jump in, that must be why Matthew Lee Anderson and those guys want to perpetuate this, because it gives them a foot in the door in the dating game.
Don't think I haven't had the same thoughts. What I honestly think though is immediately I just think, okay, well, if a woman on birth control is attracted to a feminine man, then naturally that feminine man most likely does not have proper T levels. So you think about the fact that this woman is already on a pill or whatever mechanism she's using for birth control that is already suppressing her hormones, and she's attracted to a man who probably has a real possible likelihood of struggling with infertility himself because if he might have low testosterone. And you just have a recipe for these individuals also just connecting and marrying off, if they marry, individuals who already biologically are going to struggle with having children. And so that's another interesting angle that it just seems like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that birth control begets more birth control.
Sure. And that's even if they get away from Disney Plus long enough to try to have a child.
Right.
you're talking about a degraded human lifestyle that would be unfathomable even 2 generations ago. and we have all these. I mean, that's what Pistol Creek said. Something is making it harder these days. Everything is making it harder these days.
Yeah.
We live in a culture that has for generations now been aiming every significant resource it has at making people think lifelong monogamy is not credible. I've run into this with Christian students I've worked with recently, talking about just, marriage isn't always easy and the difficulties of my own household. And, they just found the idea that someone could survive in a monogamous relationship through the course of their life is just beyond the reach of credibility. That didn't happen by accident. That happened by cultural programming. And so if you think about the church isn't immune to these things, particularly not when we have compromiser theologians working to push the same ideas under Christian branding. So what's making it harder is everything. The church is going to have to start being more explicit about this and treating people who want to normalize this nonsense as the spiritual dangers that they really are.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to rant, but I mean, this stuff is insidious, man. It's insidious.
It truly is. And I've had, it's not my first time touching this topic, but I think it's a topic that continually bears repeating because there's so many angles to this conversation, and there's so many individuals that are falling prey. And I think the thing that my heart as a dad really goes out to these women, especially that as I've seen my wife become a mother, to see so many of these women having bought into this feminist cultural lie that they could have everything, and wait to put off their family until they're in their 30s. And, there are some women who are lucky and their body works just fine in their 30s. And God has blessed them with the ability to still have, a family life later on in their lives. But there are many individuals that are finding themselves in their mid 20s struggling with fertility, let alone these individuals who don't even start until they're on the other side of 30. And my heart breaks for these individuals that are waking up to the cultural lies, but they're waking up too late. And like you said earlier, I think that there's something that there's some real responsibility that these individuals have to accept, that they participated in these cultural lies. But simultaneously, they were born into this culture that the lie was now the norm. And so, for me, I want to, as often as possible, to stand in front of a megaphone and try to, scream it far and wide to hopefully get some of these younger men and women to turn around before it's too late.
Well, on that point, not to black pill, and I don't know if you have other pastors who are watching this, but one of the things that's been on my mind more recently is another looming catastrophe that we're going to have to pastor people through. You're going to have young people who wake up to this and want to swim against the cultural waters, catch a vision for it, really want to give themselves to it, and they'll be married for like 2 or 3 years, and they're having a hard time, getting pregnant, and they're going to find out that because their parents gave one of them a vaccine when they were under their care, they're now sterilized and unable to reproduce. And it's going to be devastating for them as a couple. It's going to be devastating for their relationship to their parents. It is going to be there is a relational time bomb that is ticking away under our feet. And we're going to need to care for people as the church through those circumstances. You're also going to have young men or young women who have a promising prospect, someone that they're deeply in love with. They think they can see the roadmap to God blessing them with a lifelong marriage. And one of them is going to find out the other is vaccinated and going to have major hesitations about committing themselves to a person who is long-term in order to avoid this kind of exact scenario. And that's going to be devastating as well. I mean, again, I think there's good things the church can do, but we are getting ready to inherit a host of troubles on this front that we've not even seen yet.
Yeah. I tend to agree. And the reality is that just healthcare professionals have burned their credibility so much. Obviously find your own great local doctor and get to know them, and you can isolate yourself if you put in the work from some of this madness. But as a whole, institutionally, even if some of these procedures that we've been talking about are completely, harmless, truly harmless to reproductive, uh, mechanisms, at the end of the day, the trust has been so shot that skepticism that you already pointed out, that's going to still be there. I mean, there's already individuals that have made jokes on dating apps, and maybe some of them aren't joking, I should say, about whether or not you're pure blooded, referring to these types of medications. And it's just, unfortunately, the reality that we have to deal with. That, I even look back on how I was raised, and I think about how, some of these chemicals and these toys, or these foods that I ate growing up, how they affected me. And I wonder how much I've been affected by, just our broad cultural things that we consider to be normal. So, either way, I think that we're going to have a ton of these issues. But I do want to mention a white pill, because you kind of brought it up
Please do.
earlier, and it is a white pill. Obviously, it's not a silver bullet solution, but you mentioned how men are trending. They're trending right wing, and I tend to agree with you on that front. And the blessing around some of the statistics around male leadership and the church. I'm sure you've seen some of these stats before, Jeff, as a pastor, but it's been proven that when a man takes his family to church as a new convert, the likelihood that the rest of the family converts is somewhere extremely high. If I'm being conservative, it's for sure over 80%. It might even be in the 90s, though, some of these statistics. Whereas if the wife happens to come to Christ first and starts going to church and trying to bring her family to church, it's only like a 30% chance that the husband will actually convert and the family will convert. And with children, if children's won over by VBS, it's like a 12% likelihood that the family is actually going to be reached by the child's faith. And so, on one hand, that's an indictment of the church, because we spend so much time on children's facilities and VBSs, and there's nothing wrong with any of that. But I mean, so few churches have a thriving men's ministry. So in that regard, the church should feel shame for having these statistics that we can point to and kind of ignoring them. But the white pill in all that is, if these young men are truly trending more conservative, especially if the church can be there with a masculine Christianity that appeals to these men, that can actually reach them and let them know that these cravings that they have are good and beautiful, and really feed them the gospel through those natural desires. I think over time we could see the culture turn around, because when men lead, the rest of the culture follows. But of course, in the shorthand, we're going to have a very, very bumpy ride to get there. But I'm hoping that long term we'll see similar results, on a macro level that we see in some of those micro examples.
Well, two things coming off of that. You'd asked earlier, I'm kind of throwing back to earlier, what can we do to get in the way of this cultural tidal wave? You mentioned churches. For my money, the other thing, I mentioned hospitality. The church can do hospitality and show people the goodness of kids. Churches can just welcome kids and enjoy kids. And, I don't want to be too critical of my brothers and sisters out there, but I don't mean building better youth facilities. I don't mean building cooler youth wings. I mean, invite families into church in corporate worship. Make it a place where children know they're welcome and that they're not treated as a distraction or an annoyance. I think the church as a congregation should lead the way in loving children. That's powerful. Now, I'm not saying anybody who's got a youth ministry is, compromised or anything like that. I'm just saying that when we warehouse our generations in different parts of the church building, we're saying something about what we think of each generation. And I think we'd be wise to start bringing those things back closer together in the life of the body. So to the point, though, about the white pill with men, here's what that's going to look like, though, Connor. And tell me if you see if my prognostication is off, okay? if you're listening to this, or you're, thinking about someone in their mid-20s, they may be able to avoid this. But anybody younger than mid-20s is going to fall into, I think, one of two camps. It's going to be a bunch of high-capacity, high-performing men competing for a select number, a smaller number of really desirable women. There's going to be more men than women. And so the competition for the scarce resource is going to really ramp up. The other person, and this is, I feel kind of cringy saying it this way, but this is where missionary dating is going to have to become sort of another option or another tool in the tool belt. You're going to have to look at a young lady who maybe has 60% of what you want in a wife. And you're going to have to evaluate, is she actually converted? Because if the Holy Spirit is part of her life, that's a tremendous advantage to you. But will you pursue her and do the hard work of calling her out of the cultural nonsense she's believed? Again, I think women will follow, but I think it's going to take men working very hard to literally win a woman. And I don't know which one. I don't know what I would have done. I don't know. I feel like I've done very well in my marriage. I don't know what I would have done in those circumstances. Do you try to become the most desirable male in the social circle? Or do you say, well, she's not there all the way. She's been fed a lot of lies, but I love her enough to see her out of them. That's very Christ-like. But it's going to take a lot of work, which is also Christ-like. I just don't know. I don't know what guys are going to do, what choice they're going to make, but I don't see an alternative. Do you see a third option there?
I think to some degree it's going to just be trusting the Lord's provision, and not to say that as a cop out, but just to some degree, where my mind went immediately with that is I started thinking there's probably going to be a lot of really well-off guys that are just going to be dating young women.
Yeah, sure.
I think there'll probably be more age gaps, and that's not necessarily what I would, hope for. But if that ends up being the only way to pursue righteous marriage in the eyes of Christ, then so be it.
Well, and that's a version of what I said in the first category. What guy has accomplished the most? Who has made himself most attractive in a comprehensive sense? Right. And some guys who get some years on them and can get ahead in terms of household building before their wife, they're going to have a leg up. I mean, again, in some ways, that's sort of returning to historical norms, right? There used to be a pretty large gap because a man was supposed to be able to secure a means of wealth production before he could be blessed with a wife. So in that sense, it's kind of a return to the old days, but that's part of what's going to be happening.
Yeah. And only time will tell. And we could easily do a part 2 on this, but we'll just wrap it up there for now. But Jeff, where can people go to keep up with you and everything that you've got going on?
Yeah, I'm on X or Twitter at merely J Wright. I have to kind of put a spoiler there. That's probably my most hostile self, because that's the public arena where you can still talk to bad guys and try to get in their way. And so if you see me on there, I'm much more pleasant in real life. I have a podcast called Backwoods Belief that comes out fairly regularly. And if you're interested, you can find me around there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, listeners. We appreciate you joining us. Feel free to go on over to forgeandanvil.substack.com, put in your email for free, and you can get all these episodes sent to you as they release. And of course, there's a paid option as well if you'd like to join in and get some of these episodes early in your inbox. We appreciate all of you joining us, and we will see you next time.